everyone, my name is Louise, also known as the Nerdy Archer, and welcome to episode 7 of the Rookery's Archives. I'm the archivist and nerd, guiding you through the lore and history of the AC franchise. And according to the people over at the AC Wiki, I can now add the Lady of Mercia to my list of titles. Do I have a kingdom now? Is that how this works? But after a few weeks away, searching through the archives and lore and battling through never-ending river raids in Valhalla, we are back! And just a slight warning, this episode will be discussing content and lore reveals from Assassin's Creed Valhalla that are paramount to the main story. If you haven't yet finished the game or are already familiar with the information I might discuss, spoilers are ahead. As well as some butchered pronunciations, but that's pretty par for the course at this point. So the Isu, or those who came before, among their many names, have been a pretty substantial unknown factor of the AC franchise since pretty much the beginning. And after finishing Valhalla, finishing the main story and going back through some of the information we learnt from that and the other games, particularly this most recent trilogy, it got me thinking. Until Valhalla, we knew that there was this thing and concept called sages, and they were reincarnations of one particular Isu figure. But Valhalla turned that on its head and revealed that there were loads of other Isu who went through the same process. And it got me thinking, who else might be an unknown sage, or which Isu figures that we have not yet been introduced to might later have one revealed. Now, as a disclaimer, for those mythological figures whose Isu names we don't currently know, I will be referring to them by their mythical names, e.g. Zeus or Freya. And for those like Juno, who have multiple names and faces, I will be sticking to just one. So Minerva is Minerva, so not to be confused with Minerva and Athena, and so on. So this episode will be running down how sages were created, which Isu have confirmed sages, or a collection of them, and a couple of little identifying tricks and possible theories as to who might have one. But first on the agenda, we must identify who sages were, who they actually are, and how they were created. In short, sages are members of the Isu reborn into human bodies millennia after the Great Catastrophe, over 75,000 years ago. They can be reborn again and again, and while their reincarnations are not exact copies of themselves into a new being, there are aesthetic similarities. They might look alike, but they're not completely the same person before memories filter back through. They each have their personality quirks and individuality that we love as human beings. Maybe there's a strong jawline that repeats throughout time, the appeal for a certain aesthetic, or certain genetic things that bleed through. The particular Isu, or one who came before, is still part of them, but the human sage is an individual in their own right. From a biological standpoint, the DNA of sages consists of a significantly higher proportion of the triple helix first civilization DNA. And I hear you ask, how significant? Well, our boy Desmond Miles. Remember him? He was human with less than a millionth of a percent of that triple helix DNA, which was one of the highest recorded levels in a human. Now, Desmond is not a sage, but if we look at reports of an actual sage, they had somewhere between 5 and 6%. With this higher rate of triple helix DNA, they are theorized to have some special ability to interact with the first Civ technology, to understand their language, and even possibly control pieces of Eden. We've seen hints of this throughout Valhalla, and it's one theory I have as to why Eivor and King Arthur were able to retrieve and later wield Excalibur. Now, sages aren't exactly the common thing. For the Isu, not all of them went underneath this procedure, with the Great Catastrophe incoming and coming soon. Some of the scientists and technicians were trying a different method of surviving it. Instead of trying to prevent it, or figuring out a way of having civilization survive the other side of this massive world-ending scenario, many of the Isu scientists took a third option and decided to find a way to reincarnate themselves and be reborn on the other side. Now, the sage and the Isu who was reborn you've probably heard the most about is Aita. After the human Isu war, the Grand Temple, where we end AC through with that moment, gave several different options to try and save the world. And the fifth option is the one that Aita volunteered for, this grand experiment to attempt to try and transfer his consciousness into an artificial body, very nearly killed him. And he couldn't be healed, and his wife, Juno, unable to be healed, Juno had no choice but to euthanize her husband, who had since been reincarnated as a human time and time again. Which is quite ironic when you think about how much they despised humans, were against humans gaining their own free will in the first place during the Illuminati cast era. With Juno herself stuck in the grave for over 75,000 years, they were attempting to be reunited. Not as a stage, though, and there is an entire story about their attempts to be reunited, which includes a cult, the modern storylines in the AC comics, and the Shroud of Eden from Syndicate. Juno is just one of the multiple Isu who have been discovered in the 2,500 years previous, displayed in both the games and the literature of the series, of having something of themselves surviving beyond the catastrophe. Not as sages, though, but in recordings like Minerva, or as inside pieces of Eden like Consus or Durga. Aita, however, has been reincarnated into multiple different personalities throughout history, although only 8 have been confirmed as of 2020. These confirmed include Abstergo employee John Standish, the pirate Black Bart, and Elijah Miles. Yes, as in the son of Desmond Miles. And while we don't really know if the German spy in 1916 London, who was dispatched by Lydia Fry, was even an Isu of Aita, they could have been the reincarnation of someone else entirely. The only reason we can imply this is due to his connection with the instruments of the First Will, a notorious cult for being very pro-Juno. I'll cover them another time, but that is the basics and shall do for now. But as of Valhalla, we now know that Aita was not the only one to ride out the catastrophe in this way, that there are other Isu out there, those Asgardians who uploaded their consciousnesses, seeing out the end of the world in a way differently from Minerva and those who lived through it, being more proactive and discovering a way to upload their minds so they could develop sages. There is even a line during one of Eivor and Odin's little chats, which implies that they might have also been reborn several times before the events of the 9th century. And actually, the world building and the introduction of the new sages and Isu in Valhalla brings in female sages. Sif and Freya are 2 of the Asgardians who went through the 7th solution and have sages of their own, possibly also Idun. And then on the human side of the equation we have Eivor and Valka's mother who are sages. So now that we know what a sage is, fundamentally, how do you spot one? And that used to be such a simple question. For Aita, many of his reincarnations inherited the similar appearances that I mentioned before, with the one prevailing part most of them seem to have developed is heterochromia, aka having eyes that are 2 different colours. 1 or 2 of his sages have been found purely because of their mismatched eyes. Remember that giant statue of a sage in Black Flag? Yeah, that has helped to uncover sages even before they knew about the connection themselves. The notable exception to the rule is, of course, Germain, Grand Master of the Parisian Templars during the French Revolution. There's even a discussion to be made whether or not David Bowie was also a sage. This idea of having an identifying mark actually comes across as a significant plot point during Basim's, aka Loki's, search for the other sages from the Aesir and Vanir. Each of them have this marking on their necks from the 7th solution and the Yggdrasil machine. Of course, with one notable exception covered in scarring that hid her from being discovered. And then again, it's not all about the aesthetics. There's the mentality of the situation too. Over time, the memories of the sage and the Isu seep through until they could potentially take over. We saw it with Basim and slightly with Sigurd and Eivor, although the latter was able to turn away from that personality takeover. And again, with the high concentration of triple helix DNA, certain sages are able to withstand this takeover and remain themselves, like the aforementioned Eivor and Elijah. Although our primary example of sages comes from Aita, and that's who we know the most about, there's no real guarantee that all of the Isu who acquired this technology to return as sages behave the same way in their new incarnations, or as hostile, nor that all humans who gradually become aware of this affiliation would merely sit and allow this takeover. We have seen them fight it, and part of me wants to believe that maybe there is a sage out there with a more benevolent experience. Perhaps there is this duality, a coexistence similar to Talion and the Wraith from Middle-earth's Shadow of Mordor, working as a team and drawing on each individual's skills instead. Pulling back the curtain a little, if we peek at the myths already used to inspire the writers and the new tales spun with them, the deities both have good and evil tendencies. Some more aligned one way or the other, so why not have some that are solely on the side of the humans? And there were some Isu who supported them during the war after all. And that is all we have on sages, and it's still really not a lot. Approximately 10 of those who came before have been reborn, rather than having their consciousnesses existing at other manners. Which got me thinking, if we take a look at some of the mythologies they have already covered with the series, or will likely revisit in the upcoming Wrath of the Druids DLC, who else might be a sage, or likely have a connection to one? We've talked a lot about those who came before and their part in this, but what about the humans? These figures were reborn into humanity. Surely there are some out there we haven't touched upon. or even key figures in mythology and history that might have been a reincarnation of a said Isu. For instance, you could argue that King Arthur Pendragon, the legendary hero of Britain, was a sage, as someone with only a high amount of Isu DNA is able to resist certain side effects of pieces of Eden. We've seen it in the apples, and surely you would want to have a safety switch installed in something like a greatsword called Excalibur. Also, the myth surrounding his return at the time of England's greatest news, returning from beyond death itself, sounds very much like the reincarnation of an Isu. Or how about Alexander the Great? Some records suggest he might have had heterochromia, and his relationship with Hephaestion might have mirrored that of Achilles and Patroclus, especially when you consider his declaration before the joint tomb in 334 BC. And how about the Isu side of the equation? Who else might have taken the plunge into writing out the Great Catastrophe another way? We now have a clear depiction of the Norse pantheon. So let's head back to Greek and Roman, where we only have Aita confirmed at the moment. Even though Aita's not actually Greco-Roman, but let's just pretend for this exercise that he is. Let's pick one of the Greek gods from the pantheon. One of my personal favourites. Artemis, goddess of the hunt and someone who has strong influences of being on a much more benevolent side of the story. She's a protector, and I doubt it would take that much to change some of her myths into this lore for the games in a way that shows her fighting for the side of the humans in the war and protecting them even beyond death. What connection could she have had with Eve and Callisto? Doesn't that sort of remind you of something to do with the Olympus effect? I'd keep those questions in mind because, well, you're going to have to wait for her full story. I feel absolutely horrible pulling this cliffhanger episode ending on you, but there is so much to talk about here that it was too long just to put in this one episode, which is why you will have to check back in for next week to hear about Artemis's Isu in more detail. This video is actually but the first part of a spiritual two-part episode. While this podcast talked a lot about the background of sages, I've taken a leaf out of the good old book on creative writing and designed my own. There is so much mystery surrounding the Isu that even 14 years into the franchise, we are still learning new fundamental details about them and allowing us to present more questions. Just like I did in the very first episode with Lydia Fry's hypothetical full game, I will be dividing back into the lore and history and the mythologies, and using all of that to see how Artemis, or Diana if we're calling them all by the Greek deities, by their Roman titles, could be slotted into this existing universe using the lore and the rules it's already provided for us. And in case you missed it, I was a guest on the most recent episode of the Hookblade podcast, where I sat down with hosts Lawson and Tim to talk about Assassin's Creed Syndicate. The duo were so much fun to talk to, and I don't think I've laughed that hard recording a podcast episode in such a long time. A link to the video will be in the end card for this episode, as well as in the description below if you are on mobile. Until then, let me know down below in the comments which historical and mythological figure characters you think could be a sage on either side of the equation. Do you agree with me? Is there someone important that I missed out or haven't considered? Would you like to see a full episode and me talking through a list of possible figures? And is there any other topic you would like me to talk about? Comment down below. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and stick around for more. But that is all for today's episode of the Rookery's Archives. Thank you all so much for listening. My name is Louise, also known as the Nerdy Archer, and I hope to see you flying back to the Rookery soon.